Good evening. I'm Mike Knetter, coming to you from New York. Welcome to the UW Now Livestream, where we bring you experts from the Badger community talking about timely and important topics. Tonight, we ask two of our regular guests to offer their predictions for the year ahead for the economy and politics. We also invite you to make your own predictions in the chat, and as well as your questions for our guests. A few questions we hope to answer tonight is, how will the Fed fare in its quest for that elusive soft landing? As you know, they're battling both inflation and now a lot of geopolitical uncertainty as they try to bring inflation down in our economy without causing a recession. How will investors rebalance their portfolios with higher short-term interest rates? And then finally, what lies ahead in American electoral politics? Will we see a rematch of the 2020 presidential election? And what will happen in state houses around the country? Join us to peer into the future of the economy and American politics with two UW experts. Brad Tank is an expert on macroeconomics and monetary policy. He's the chief investment officer for Neuberger Berman Asset Management, a global firm with over $400 billion in assets under management. He's a graduate of the Applied Securities program at the Wisconsin School of Business. Barry Burden is the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science, and he's the director of the Elections Research Center at UW Madison. His research and teaching are based in American politics with emphasis on elections and representation. Thank you both for joining us tonight. You've both been here before. There's a reason you're back. You're great and entertaining speakers, and you have a wealth of knowledge to share with our alums, and we really appreciate you taking the time. We are going to begin this evening with Brad Tank, and Brad is going to get us started by talking about the economy and financial markets. So Brad, I'll give you the floor. Take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Great to be here. And hopefully another reason why we're back is we're not too bad at forecasting. So having done this before, forecasting is a very imperfect process, part art, part science. I went back and looked at our live stream from a year ago, and I think collectively as a group we did okay. I'll review some of the forecasts that I made and how they proved to be either right or wrong, and then make some forecasts for the year ahead as well. Interestingly enough, when we did this a year ago, we did it exactly on the day when the inflation statistic for the United States for the month of November was released. And the same thing happened today. So we got what's proven to be by far and away the most interesting and controversial economic statistic on a monthly basis for the last couple of years, and that's the monthly inflation statistic. The good news is today we got generally good news, certainly relative to the last couple of years, with year-on-year headline price inflation coming in a little bit north of 3% at 3.1%, and so-called core inflation, where you take out food and energy, at about 4%. When we were together a year ago at this time, both numbers were up around 7%. So we've made a lot of progress on the inflation front. And Mike asked the same question to be answered a year ago. How's the Fed going to fare with respect to accomplishing a reduction in inflation? And we can give them a pretty good grade just on the basis of what's happened so far. And the other interesting aspect to the forecast last year, was resoundingly in favor of a much slower economy than actually materialized. So not only did they make some terrific accomplishments on the inflation front, they've managed to do it so far without an economic contraction and surprisingly strong economic growth. So we look back again at some of the forecasts last year. Inflation generally was presumed to come down by just about all forecasters. We were suffering through a lot of the disruptions that were the result of the COVID lockdowns and the massive response from central banks and governments around the world, both in terms of monetary policy and, of course, fiscal policy. And what we witnessed in 2022 and certainly 21, and it continues to still ripple through the global economy, is very unusual aftershocks of the post-COVID impact of these extraordinary policies on both the monetary front and the fiscal front. They are receding. There's no question about it. But if we look at some of the reasons as to why forecasters got 2023 wrong in terms of economic growth, a lot of it just has to do with the unique characteristics of the post-COVID world economy. And as I say, some of it continues to linger on, and I'll get into that here in just a moment. With respect to growth, a year ago, 2/3, Wall Street Journal does regular surveys of many economic forecasters. A survey can include 50 plus economists, and over 2/3 at that time were predicting a recession. I made mention a year ago that this was the most widely forecast recession that we'd ever seen in 40 years. And what happens when everybody believes something's going to happen? Well, we found out it didn't happen. And we didn't get a recession. And as we sit here today with economic growth coming in this year, much stronger than expected, on average in the US, about 2.5%. Year's not completely done. We'll wind up somewhere in that range in terms of real economic growth. Surprisingly enough, most forecasters aren't calling for a recession next year. The numbers are about flipped, about 2/3 looking for a so-called soft landing or a deceleration in growth without an economic contraction, and still about 1/3 calling for a recession or a meaningful downturn. A year ago at this time, staying with Mike's question about the Fed, we had Fed funds at around 4.5%. General consensus was they were going to move higher. They actually moved a bit higher than expectations. Mid-year, last year, inflation was proving to be very sticky. And as we know, about mid-year this year, they got the federal funds rate to between 5.25% and 5.5%, which is where they've stayed for the last few meetings. We've got a meeting coming up this week, and the expectation is they're going to stay put. And now we're in a very different set of circumstances with the market forecasting nothing out of the U.S. Central Bank for the next couple of quarters, but then some meaningful reductions in policy rates in the second half of 2024. And I'll come back to that again in a moment. A year ago, we witnessed rising interest rates pretty much relentlessly, not only policy rates, but market rates throughout all of 2022, produced very negative, historically negative returns in bonds, very negative returns in stocks. And with a lot of the heavy lifting having been done by the central banks, their general forecasts, including ours, were that 23 was going to usher in better markets, better bond markets, better stock markets. But no one anticipated we see anything like NASDAQ up 30%, which is where we stand here today. S&P up about 15%, Dow up about 10%, small stocks up about 7%. Now, if you're a close follower of the markets, you realize a lot of that happened in the last month. S&P was flirting with flat on the year at the end of October. And so we've gotten some near historic rallies over the course of the last months or so. And a lot of that simply has to do with the growing belief that the central bank is done in terms of raising interest rates. They're going to pause for a while, and the next move will be lower. In terms of our forecasts at Neuberger Berman, a year ago, many of our forecasts were quite a bit different than consensus, particularly on inflation. We felt it would remain stickier. As we look forward to 2024, consensus on inflation is it's going to continue to decline. It will not get to their target of 2%, but from current levels, we'll be in the mid-2s by the end of the year. And we generally don't have much of a quarrel with that consensus forecast on inflation. That being said, there's some pretty good variability around that forecast. And that variability will come from some of the areas that have been very well behaved, that has helped the Fed accomplish meaningfully lower price inflation this year. And those areas, of course, are energy. We all know oil prices have been soft this year. Again, contrary to predictions a year ago, energy complex generally has been fairly soft. A lot of the commodity complex has been soft. And food prices have been very well behaved. Again, against expectations a year ago, when concerns were principally focused on the breadbasket of Europe with the situation unfolding in Ukraine, and we still are unfortunately in a world where we have wars happening, and that means price of energy, price of food is still subject to disruption based on shipping or other factors that can come into play. So an optimistic forecast on inflation assumes that we continue to get better numbers on wages, on housing, on rents, but also that food and energy remain relatively well behaved. And if there's a risk in the inflation forecast for 2024, it's food and energy. Watch them. Certain things are fairly predictable. Rent prices, housing prices, soft based on the response to very high mortgage rates. So we'll continue to get good news on the house price and the rental front. Another area where we've seen stickiness, and we would expect it to continue, is in service economy wages, which have been very, very strong. Wall Street Journal just did a piece about all the different union settlements over the course of the last year. This was a remarkably strong wage settlements across a whole range of both service and manufacturing industries. And it's something I'll hit on when I close. Call it the rise of the worker. Wages are going up, and it's one of the reasons continuing to go up at a strong rate. And it's one of the reasons why we didn't see a recession in 2023. There's a handful of reasons why the forecasters were wrong. And one of it has to do with at the time when a lot of the payments, the direct payments from the federal government, either to businesses or directly to families and consumers, were running out, wage growth was beginning to overtake generalized price inflation. And it means that even here today, while the consumer is showing some signs of softening, the consumer in the United States remains in much better shape than people anticipated a year ago. And when you look at some of these wage gains, obviously what happened in the auto industry got a lot of attention, but it's happened both in the public sector and in the private sector. It's happened in service industries as well as manufacturing industries. Well, generalized price inflation is down by 2/3. Wage inflation is only off by a modest percentage, about depending on what component of the economy you're looking at, maybe 1% to 1.5%. And certain areas of the economy got huge boosts coming out of COVID, particularly the restaurant, hotel, and other service industries, and they've managed to hang on to a lot of those gains. So generally good for consumers. Helped explain some of the good economic performance in 2023 and should carry forward a bit into 2024 as things unfold. I think another reason why the forecasts for a recession proved to be a bit off was the massive amount of what one would describe as preemptive financing that took place with this long period of record low interest rates. So if you're fortunate, you refinanced your mortgage or you took down a new mortgage sometime in 2022 or 2021, maybe the early part of last year rather than the latter part, and you've locked in some very attractive long-term funding. You know, with mortgage rates, 30-year mortgage rates in the United States being up north of 7% recently, but below 3% at the trough back in 2021. It's meant that the brunt of this big rise in interest rates has not been felt by many homeowners, particularly those that have done long-term financing. It's yielded a very sluggish housing market in terms of turnover, new sales. Prices have gotten a bit soft. By some measures, housing is as slow today in the United States as any time in the last 40 years. And it will remain fairly slow unless we get more relief on the mortgage front. But with rates having already come down so far in the last 5 or 6 weeks by about 0.75%, one would expect that logjam starting to break up or open up. Another aspect, which wasn't fully understood a year ago, you know, economic statistics are always revised, and hindsight's 2020. We actually got a bigger correction in the manufacturing and goods sector of the U.S. economy in the first half of 2022 than we knew. we actually saw a contraction in the U.S. economy in the first half of 2022. So in many industries, the big post-COVID boom in goods production and post-COVID demand for certain goods yielded a correction that hit pretty hard certain industries and worked their way through it. And those industries have exercised a lot of discipline with respect to inventories and supply chains and profit management. And as we go into 2024, generally things look pretty good. Margins have held up better than in many industries than would have expected. Inventories are reasonable. And again, reflecting on what happened last year, we had a bit of a mini banking crisis that we came through in reasonably decent shape. It started in March of last year around a couple of banks that were a little bit too aggressive with respect to portfolio management and taking interest rate risk. And the regulators collectively did a pretty good job. And by the time we got into summer, it was pretty much through. There are some aftershocks. But the fact of the matter is, again, the banking sector is in pretty good shape as we go into 2024. So many of the reasons why we didn't see a recession last year suggest that things should hold reasonably strong as we go into 2024. Another factor which has gotten a lot of attention in the last year, and I think is going to continue to get a lot more attention, is this big ongoing policy debate around interest rates. Are really low interest rates good for growth? The presumption was that they were. But now that we've just completed this experiment that run from the financial crisis up until a year and a half ago, there are many economists, money managers weighing in on the opposite side of the equation, saying that really low rates actually hurt growth and reasonable rates or modest rates can actually be beneficial to growth. And that's a longer term debate. It's something that I can say at Neuberger Berman, we weigh in on the side of normal rates, a normal yield curve, conventional monetary policy. Not a lot of these grand experiments that were run in the post-financial crisis world are generally supportive of better growth. So we believe that's true. And so part of the reason why, in a sense, things are doing better is there's whole parts of the economy that are actually better off with higher rates. Think about insurance companies. Think about the banks, as long as they don't take too much risk. Think about savers and retirees. I mentioned a year ago at this time, people were looking at almost 9% increase in their Social Security payments. For Social Security beneficiaries, 2023 was a pretty good year. Their spending probably wasn't crimped with that kind of increase, and that was a result of higher rates and higher inflation. So one book I recommend to a lot of people that I was reading about this time last year was by Edward Chancellor. It's called The Price of Time. If you really want to get into detail on why normal interest rates are actually more supportive of growth and very low interest rates are counterproductive, Edward wrote what's probably the most complete and convincing thesis on that topic. So without getting into that, I'll simply recommend the book and leave it up to you if you want to pursue it or not. So looking forward to this year, I said about 1/3 of forecasters are calling for a recession, 2/3 aren't. The average forecast does look for the U.S. economy to decelerate from about 2.5% real growth to about 1.5%. Inflation to go from about 3% headline, 4% core, to something a bit north of 2%, call it 2.5%. And what does that mean? We still have nominal growth. If those forecasts are reasonable, we're still looking at nominal growth next year of somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 4.5%. And that should support reasonably decent returns in fixed income. Bond markets this year did okay, about 3% for high grade bonds, better for junk, about 10%. And higher coupons mean that we can count on more of the return coming in and month out rather than relying on capital gains. And the equity markets have displayed all kinds of variability depending on industry sector, growth versus value, small cap versus large cap. But on average, I think risk assets are something that people are clearly becoming more comfortable with. And 2024 shouldn't look too much different than 2023, although I wouldn't expect 30% on the NASDAQ, and I wouldn't expect 10% on US high yield. But I think positive returns barring any unforeseen shocks, are in the offing for next year. So I will stop there, and we'll move on to politics. But I'll be happy to answer some questions once we get through the political conversation. And the economy is going to be exciting next year, but I think politics is going to be really exciting.
I couldn't agree more, Brad. Thank you for those thoughts, recap of last year and an outlook for next year. Indeed, we've got some questions rolling in particular about real wages and whether inflation might be understated. Some people seem to feel like inflation is a bigger issue than maybe is reported. I'd love your thoughts on that. But let's turn it over to Barry Burden. Obviously, sometimes how the economy goes, the election goes, and we will be curious to know your thoughts about elections 2024 and whether a soft landing benefits the incumbents and other things that are on your mind. So take it away, Barry.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. These two topics are definitely connected, and I just want to say hello to everyone. I'm right here in the middle of the UW campus. Bascom Hill is outside my dark window here. So glad to see everybody here from Madison. I'm going to try to give you a sense of how a political scientist thinks about the 2024 elections, especially for president and for Congress that are coming up just about a year from now. And if you remember nothing else from tonight's talk, it's one headline conclusion, which is that all three of those bodies, the presidency, the House, and the Senate, are up for grabs. This is on the next slide. Now, in saying this, I'm going to assume for the moment we have the two presidential candidates figured out. They are Joe Biden, who's on a glide path to be the Democratic nominee again, typical for an incumbent president. He has only nominal opposition. Even if not all Democrats are happy about him as the nominee, he is the guy. And on the Republican side, it's an open contest, but it is the least competitive open contest in the modern history of presidential elections. Donald Trump is so dominating the GOP nomination. It looks really nothing like a normal open competition. He is winning the money race. He is winning the polling race, as you've probably seen, national polls and also polls in the early states like Nevada and Iowa. He's up by 30, 40, 50 points. Recent Iowa poll just came out this week, and it was the largest lead for any non-incumbent candidate running in the Iowa caucuses. He has the most endorsements from members of Congress, Republican governors, other leaders of the party. So there's really just no serious competition happening there. And with Iowa and New Hampshire only being now something like 70 days away, I don't see anything changing that anytime soon. So I'm just going to stipulate those are the two nominees in the general election, unless something pretty dramatic would happen. And I'll just note that's strange. Donald Trump in particular is a very unusual nominee for a party. When parties lose the White House, they typically part ways with the candidate who was at the top of the ticket. That's true for Republicans and Democrats. When Mitt Romney did not win the general election, when Hillary Clinton did not win the general election, their parties said, thank you very much for your service. We're going to try something different. But Donald Trump actually lost in 2020, obviously, but he also lost the popular vote in 2016. He's indicted in multiple cases. He's been impeached twice. He's a former president, just a very unusual package. And Republicans have stuck with him. They have stuck with him so much that the Republican National Committee has decided they're going to stop holding debates between the other Republican candidates. They've held 4 of them, and this week decided they're out of the business. So if other media outlets want to hold those debates on their own, they're welcome to do that. But it's going to be those two. So why are these 3 bodies up for grabs? One is that there's very close competition between the 2 major parties for the White House and for congressional seats. And the particular features of those institutions mean that very small changes in the vote, smaller changes than we can even pick up in polling, could tilt the election one way or the other. So all 3 of them are kind of teetering on a precipice that's very fragile, and lots of small things could matter to push it one way or the other. Okay, so let's look at some factors. I'm going to pick up in a way where Brad left off on the next slide and think about the role of economics. This is what sometimes political scientists call the fundamentals, the background factors of the state of the economy and other national conditions. They tend to be very good predictors of how elections will go. Economic performance, in particular macroeconomic performance of the US economy, pretty tightly correlated with the share of the vote that the incumbent party in the White House wins. This is just one example of that. This is a measure of GDP growth from the first quarter of the election year, so that'd be early after the turn of the year, to the third quarter, just before Election Day. The increase or decrease in that growth is pretty strongly related to the share of the popular vote that the incumbent party wins. You can see essentially all of the post-war elections there, and the regression line shows a pretty tight connection between them. Incumbent parties that are running for re-election after just one term, the way Joe Biden is, also fare pretty well. That's another one of the fundamental factors that candidates can't do much about. Incumbent presidents win about 2/3 of the time, so much better than a coin flip. Trump was an exception to that he was a one-termer. That had not happened since back in the early 90s with George H.W. Bush. If you estimate a statistical model that accounts for this GDP growth measure based on the forecast for next year, which may or may not be right, Brad can tell us, and also the status of the incumbent as a one-termer, you get a prediction of about 51% of the vote for Joe Biden. That doesn't tell us much because 51% is actually probably not enough for Democrats to win the Electoral College, which is what decides who's elected president. And also because that forecast comes with a margin of error of about plus or minus 2 percentage points. So it could very likely be anywhere in the upper 40s for the Democrats to the low to mid 50s. So even that kind of analysis doesn't give us much confidence in what's actually going to happen, other than the vote is likely to be close. So those are objective factors. How about the subjective measure of things in the polls themselves? This is what people are paying attention to now. If we go to the next slide, I want to give you hesitation in overinterpreting the polls that you're seeing in the news today. There are certainly media outlets and other organizations asking voters, or people they think might be voters, who they will choose in the 2024 presidential election. The polls conducted this far out tend to be not predictive at all of what will happen in the general election. And this figure on the right of your screen shows that. This is the correlation between the polls taken on any given day before the election with the actual result. A value of 1 would be a perfect correlation, meaning the polls match the vote perfectly. We never quite get there. Correlation of 0 would mean there's no relationship at all. You can't learn anything about the election outcome from the polls. And 300 days out, which is about where we are today, there's 0 relationship between the polls and the popular vote. I guess it was 4 years ago, Joe Biden was leading by something like 9 points. That is not where he ended up. In the election before that, Hillary Clinton was leading by 4 or 5 points on this day. She obviously didn't end up there exactly. So the polls are not especially meaningful. And it's not until a few months before Election Day where they become pretty strongly correlated. It's at about the 200-day mark, just somewhere after the nomination is often settled, that we start to see a really robust relationship between the polls and the eventual outcome. But it's not really until we get past the Labor Day mark, inside 90 days to the election, that you see the polls really tighten up and begin to be very predictive of the general election. Now, maybe 2024 will be different. We have different kind of candidates, 2 very well-known candidates, one incumbent, one former incumbent. It's not likely to be a lot of learning about those people that voters don't already know. We also have a more polarized electorate that's not likely to be bouncing around in the polls as much as we normally see. One other warning about the polls today: they are almost exclusively based on registered voters. Those are people who either tell us or can be verified in surveys that they're registered to vote. That's pretty different from the 65 or 70% of people who will actually cast ballots next year. And there's a relationship between who votes and which candidate they prefer. Right now, that's probably favoring Trump in the polls. I think he's looking a little better than you might expect when the pollsters finally begin to screen down their surveys to just people who are likely voters. Okay, so we're going to take Trump and Biden as the candidates. The other factors, sort of the polls and the fundamentals, I think wash out and aren't very helpful. So I think the best guide is actually to look back at the 2020 election and treat that as the best baseline we have for what's likely to happen. This is the map. It's sort of a modern art version of the Electoral College map, which shows the size of each state relative to the number of electoral votes it has. In contrast to the traditional map, which shows land area, candidates don't care about land area, they care about winning electoral votes. As you might remember, there are 538 electoral votes. A candidate needs to win a majority of them, or 270 to be elected president. States mostly give out their electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis. So if a candidate wins a state by any amount, they get all of the state's electors. Last time around, 5 states flipped from Republican in Trump in 2016 to Joe Biden in 2020. Those are these 3 Midwestern states that get so much attention: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, also Arizona and Georgia. The flip of those states was enough to give Biden 306 electoral votes. Now, a couple things have happened since that election. The most important is that the reapportionment of the Electoral College has happened because the census was conducted in 2020. That move alone has given Trump 3 more electoral votes than he had in 2020. He would be at 235 if the election ran exactly the same way today. 270 is the number that is needed to win. On the right side of the screen, you'll see some of the closest states from 2020. Wisconsin was very close, decided by less than a point, only 20,000 votes. Arizona, very close, 11,000. Georgia, 12,000. Any combination of 2 of those states flipping from Biden to Trump would be enough to change the outcome of the election. So a combination of, say, Georgia and Arizona flipping and the 3 Midwestern states staying as they are would be enough. That only takes about 20,000 votes. So there may be something like 200 million votes cast in the next presidential election, and 20,000 people in 2 states could change the result. So this is why I say the system is teetering on the edge, and very small things can matter a whole lot. A couple of the historical things to think about. This would be on the next slide. First is that Democrats are on a real streak in terms of winning the popular vote. 7 of the last 8 presidential elections have seen the Democrats win more votes than the Republicans. Those are the blue lines that are rising up on the right-hand side of this graph. It shows the margin of victory, and all the blue lines represent those Democratic victories. The only exception was George Bush's reelection in 2004. But before that, you have to go back to the 80s to find a time when the Republicans won the popular vote. But they have, and this is a very long streak. There's no streak in American history like this for either party. So a pretty exceptional period. But it has not meant that the Democrats have had a lock on the Electoral College. On 2 occasions in the last 6 elections, the Democrats have won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College, both in 2000 and 2016. That is because the Electoral College at the moment has a bias that favors Republicans. It's just happenstance. The states that happen to be competitive, the swing states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, are states that are more Republican than the country as a whole. Joe Biden won the popular vote by about 4.5 points 3 years ago. Wisconsin was the tipping point state, the state that put him over the top, and he just barely won it by less than a percentage point. So Wisconsin's about 4 points right of the rest of the country. And so that means the competition is happening in states that are more favorable to the GOP. That bias is currently about 2.5 points in favor of Republicans. So Democrats don't just need to win the popular vote on average. They need to win about 52 or 53% of the popular vote to get back to a 50-50 race in the Electoral College. So even if the polls were favoring Biden, we wouldn't guarantee that he's likely the person to win. Okay, a few words about Congress. In addition to the presidential race, on the next slide, you'll see all seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, 435 of them, and 1/3 of the Senate will be on the ballot next year. These races will determine whether the president who's elected has a friendly Congress or a hostile Congress. Both chambers are narrowly divided. The House, at least at the time of the last election, was 222 Republicans, 213 Democrats. That has bobbled around a little bit, and Republicans actually have a smaller majority now after George Santos was expelled a couple weeks ago. Republicans have, I think, a 4-seat margin in the House. So very easy for party control to swing there. In the Senate, it's a 51-seat majority for the Senate. So just a couple seats pick up in the Senate could flip that body as well. So both of these are also extremely close. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll show you some things to think about in both chambers. First, in the Senate, the thing to keep in mind is that the seats that are up next year are ones that would have last been up 6 years ago because of the 6-year term in the Senate. 6 years ago was 2018. That was a great year for the Democrats. They had a wonderful midterm election with Donald Trump in the White House and picked up a lot of seats they might not have otherwise won. Now they must defend all those seats because those senators are up for, in some cases, the first time. There are 3 senators running in states who are Democrats running in states that Trump won. John Tester in Montana. Am I going to get these right? Joe Manchin in West Virginia, though he's now announced that he's out. And Sherrod Brown in Ohio. There are no Republican senators running in states that Biden won. So it's just a more difficult path for the Democrats. Even in states that that Biden may have won, there's some difficult situations. In Arizona, Kyrsten Sinema is the incumbent Democrat. She has decided she's no longer a Democrat, may run as an independent in the general election. That may divide the vote in a close state against the Democrats. In New Jersey, Senator Bob Menendez has been charged with a variety of crimes. Those may hurt the chances of Democrats holding that seat. So it is quite possible that Democrats could lose 1 or 2 or 3 seats, enough to flip the Senate, and maybe more than that. So there is a high upside for Republicans there. That would affect things like judicial nominations, appointment to the Supreme Court. The House is a different story. The House has a narrow Republican majority, but Republicans have more to defend because they have more seats, but also because more of their seats are in Biden districts. So the table on the right shows that there are 18 districts currently held by Republicans that Joe Biden won. Those are all places where those Republicans are going to be vulnerable. Democrats will be spending lots of money trying to recruit strong candidates to take out those Republican incumbents in basically blue districts. On the other side, there are only 5 districts where there are Democratic incumbents in a district that Trump had won. Those are opportunities for the Republicans, but there just aren't as many. By a ratio of 3 to 1, roughly, Democrats have an advantage there. So I think it's quite possible that these chambers actually flip sides and we end up with a Senate with a Republican majority and a House with a Democratic majority. There are also some districts that are being redrawn in the House that may, on net, work to the Democrats' advantage and give them a little boost there as well. Okay, a few final things to think about on this next slide. There are some X factors, some unpredictable elements. I'm not going to try to predict, but I want to at least highlight for you that these are things that could steer things in an unpredictable direction. One is that the candidates who are running for president are the oldest ever by a lot. Trump will be, I think, 80 if he were to take office. Biden, 83. People at that age are prone to health difficulties. It's not out of the question that one or both of them could have a health incident either before the nomination is wrapped up at the summer conventions or during the general election. That would obviously create some chaos and uncertainty. We don't know who would fill in or whether they would try to proceed if they had some health troubles. So that's an unknown. Second unknown is the role of the abortion issue, which has been so powerful since the Dobbs decision last year that overturned Roe v. Wade. It has really energized Democrats and helped them do well in a lot of special elections over the last year and a half. It's hard to know if that will persist into the general election next year when there are so many other things on the table, the economy, the wars, and other military conflicts happening overseas, lots of other things. But that's been a factor that has worked to the Democrats' advantage, and I think the Republicans have had some difficulty coming up with a response to that. Third is this strange situation of not having a competitive Republican nomination. Trump is essentially walking through the nomination unvetted and without getting the kind of attention and scrutiny that a candidate would normally get. He has been scrutinized in previous elections, obviously. He's well known to the electorate, but there's this sort of imbalance in the media coverage at the moment that I think doesn't make it feel like a general election comparison between the candidates, even though that's what the polls are asking. So I think those polls are likely to change once we get to a phase where the two candidates are being contrasted against one another. Related to that, Donald Trump is indicted in or charged in 4 different cases. 3 of them I think are set to go to trial early next year. That would be happening during some of the primaries and caucuses. If they stay on schedule, I suppose it's possible there could be a verdict, maybe a sentence before the general election. I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. We've never had a presidential candidate in this situation. It's obviously a distraction from other things that would be happening on the campaign trail. and could be a real bit of uncertainty. There are questions about alternatives to the Democrats and Republicans. There is a group called No Labels, which is organizing to create a bipartisan ticket and get it ballot access in most states, if not all states. People like Joe Manchin and Joe Lieberman have been having conversations with them. Robert Kennedy Jr. was running as a Democrat, is now running as an independent in the general election, has a lot of money behind him. Cornel West, the professor from Harvard, also running. Jill Stein, a Green Party candidate. So there are a lot of non-major party candidates who could potentially get enough ballot access to be a factor, and we just don't know what that's going to look like. And then finally, to resonate on Brad's talk earlier, this is a strange economy that really doesn't have, I think, a single message about whether it ought to advantage Joe Biden as the incumbent or undermine him. Things like unemployment and the recent stock market performance have been good, and you would think would advantage him. Consumer confidence has also been up in recent polls. Those are all positives. And yet you have a public that seems wary, and many of whom believe we're in a recession at the moment. And so I think it's complicated to see exactly how the economy will play out for Biden. So these are the X factors that I get to put on the table just to protect myself when we find out what actually happens a year from now. With that, let me stop, and I'm glad to take questions.
Terrific. Thank you, Barry. And we'll bring Brad back as well. And I'll throw out a few questions that have come in. First, I just want to ask Brad, what's your sense of the behavior of real wages since the pandemic began? Obviously, we've had a lot of inflation, and now nominal wage growth is starting to catch up, but have workers, cumulatively, have they lost ground a bit? But now they're gaining ground back. And what do you make of the claim some people make that inflation is somehow chronically understated?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that question, Mike, and it's a question that it's a set of questions that's been getting asked on and off for the last couple of years, right? So, on the wage front, wage growth was slower to pick up than price growth. So there was a general sense that consumers were falling behind pretty rapidly in the early post-COVID period. What we started to see really over the course of the last year is that price levels have generally come down a lot faster than wage inflation. So wage inflation's been pretty sticky. And so the consumer's demise was predicted going back a couple of years ago based on the notion that a lot of the federal stimulus placed directly either in the hands of consumers or businesses would run out. And based on the impact of shrinking real wages, consumer would stop spending. Well, as all of that stimulus began to wear off, the relationship between price inflation and wage inflation flipped. And we've been seeing more recently and throughout much of 2023, wages growing faster than prices. They crossed over last year, and that's given the consumer a shot in the arm. Now, we're looking at some very generalized levels of both wage inflation and price inflation, and the specifics vary quite a bit depending on what prices are you talking about? Are you talking about services? Are you talking about goods? Are you talking about big durables? Are you talking about consumer products? And then, of course, wages have been all over the map as well. One of the features of the early post-COVID economy was we saw a huge boost in service sector, lower wage service sector employees, because there was just a shortage of restaurant workers, hotel workers, but even more highly paid service workers, think healthcare, has continued to have to offer substantially higher salaries and wages to continue to attract and retain people. And I think generally one of our forecasts is that's durable. One of the big takeaways that I'd like to leave people with here today is, we've seen the rise of the worker here in 2023, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. We started talking about that a couple of years ago in this format based on the changing global demographics, retiring baby boomers, the big massive demographic shift taking place in China, which is, the factory of the world, rapidly becoming short workers, massive shift in demographics. And of course, we know where other advanced economies like most of Europe and Japan stand. So I think generally speaking, people are going to do much better in terms of wages. Prices, in fact, are coming down. Now, is inflation overstated? It depends. It's a complex question to answer. It depends on where one's coming from, right? So if you look at a basket of goods consumed by the lowest quartile of income earners in the United States, they've actually suffered quite a bit more from inflation than the middle two quartiles or the top quartile, because their consumption is much more skewed toward basics like food and energy, less skewed toward purchase of big durables. So they've got a different basket of goods. That means inflation, generalized price inflation, which attempts to measure prices and services and goods over the whole economy, doesn't really represent the experience of that family or that individual. Certain places you're going to get relief. I've never heard I can't recall hearing the chief financial officer of a major auto company, and we've heard Ford CFO say, we are budgeting for lower car prices next year. Car prices are coming down, and we see what they're all doing on their EV prices. They're slashing prices pretty severely. And so certain places we're going to continue to get relief. Big durables is one area, house prices is another. But for many people, they look at a headline like we saw today at 3.1% inflation, and they say it's just overstated. That's not my experience. They've got a very different mix of things that they consume relative to the average across the entire economy. And the last point I'll make on that relates to much of what Barry has just talked about, this notion that it's a very strange economy and people aren't sure what to think about economic performance. And a lot of it relates to inflation. We're coming through a period now that's unlike anything we've seen before in terms of what's actually happening to prices. Price inflation is coming down as measured by the federal government statistical efforts, but consumer perceptions of future price inflation keeps going up. So for the last 4 or 5 months, the University of Michigan polls consumers to a 1-year horizon and a 5-year horizon, and every month for the last handful of months, the forecasts that consumers expect are going up while actual prices are coming down. And I think that just reflects the strange character of this economy, the fact that this was a big inflation shock, and you're not going to get deflation in things in basic consumer products. You may get it in cars for some period of time. You may get it in houses for some period of time, but the typical consumer small ticket item, Kimberly-Clark is not going to drop the price of toilet paper. It's just not going to happen. They may make the roll slower, but the price smaller, but the price isn't going to go down. And the average consumer, this 3.1% print today doesn't mean anything. They know prices are a lot higher than they were 3 years ago, and they may take it out on the polls a year from now. We will see. I think it's a big wild card that Barry has pointed to in his slide.
It's a very interesting comment. It's not so much the current rate of inflation, but it's the cumulative effect of price increases. They're much higher than they used to be. And even though wages are going up, they haven't caught up with the cumulative inflation that people have dealt with, is my guess. But I want to turn to you, Barry, and ask you a couple questions. Steve Goldstein wonders, do you think Biden can actually dodge a debate with Trump, and should he dodge a debate with Trump, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's likely to go the other way around. Republicans have said they don't want to participate in the usual debate process next year. The Republican National Committee has said they don't trust the Commission on Presidential Debates. This is the nonprofit that has run debates since the 1980s. Trump threatened not to participate in some of the debates in 2020. There was actually one that was canceled, and he did end up participating in the others. But right now, it looks like the Republican nominee won't be part of the debates. I don't think Biden would shy away from it if Trump was willing. Biden, I think, feels pretty comfortable in that environment. He's been in politics, since the 1970s. So he's run for president multiple times, starting in the 1980s. He has a lot of comfort in that environment. Donald Trump likes television and cameras, but Biden feels pretty comfortable on the stage as well. So if anything, I think it's the Republicans that will avoid. Trump has avoided all of the RNC debates to this point, and has even done counter programming where he's held his own events at the same time to try to get coverage for himself and steer it away from the debates. He did some of that back in 2016, 2020. So I could imagine him holding a kind of simultaneous event of some kind, a fundraiser, whatever it would be, to try to distract from if Biden and maybe the third party candidate were on a separate stage or something else. So that's my guess is how it goes.
And what do you make of the impact of a third party? Do you think kind of a moderate center candidate would pull more from Biden or from Trump?
Well, I think there are a few conflicting messages about all of that. So on the one hand, third-party candidates tend to be the most appealing to young voters. They are always the most supportive group. Doesn't matter if the third party comes from the left, it comes from the right, it's centrist or something else, whether it's Ross Perot or Ralph Nader, it's young people who have less attachment to the political parties, are just more open to the idea of somebody from outside. And that hurts the Democrats because young people have been very supportive of Democratic candidates for the last 20 years or so. And Biden needs them to stay competitive in these swing states. Also, non-white voters have been pulling away from the Democrats a little bit. They tend to be a little more enticed by non-major party candidates. So that too would hurt Biden. On the other hand, alternative candidates tend to be ones who are running against the incumbent. They're trying to tap into people who are discontent with their current situation. And you might think those would be people who'd vote against Biden already and would be inclined to go with Trump as something different. So if they see yet something that's even more different than Trump, somebody who's never been in office, is new to the scene, that might be appealing to them. The polling I've seen suggests that the No Labels group, Robert Kennedy Jr., at least those two, look like they're taking more from Trump than from Biden at this point. I don't put a lot of stock in that because, as I said, the polls are not very predictive this many days ahead, and we're only polling registered voters, not likely voters. But I think things have shifted from the early thought that was probably hurting Biden more to now probably it's hurting Trump just a bit more.
Thank you, Barry. Question for Brad. With higher interest rates now, what do you think is the optimal mix for someone, managing their own assets heading into retirement? I did see a research paper written about the other day on Bloomberg that was published in one of the finance journals that argued in favor of going just all in on stocks. What's your view on that? Does a healthy portfolio still have a mix of stocks and bonds? And, what is your thinking on that for the average American?
Well, you hit on it on the first part of the question, Mike. If you're getting ready to go into retirement, all stocks is certainly not the way to go. An all stock portfolio certainly makes a lot of sense for a young worker, somebody just beginning to save, somebody who's very confident in their income level. But even a young family that is saving for a first home probably should have some money in fixed income. If they're saving to a 3 to 5 year horizon, it's hard to say where equities exactly are going to be in 3 to 5 years. Safe to say in 10 years, they're higher, potentially a lot higher. But the virtue of fixed income is, on average, the returns are more predictable and you can tailor them. Short-term fixed income today offers some pretty attractive yields, north of 5%, high-quality bond portfolio. We haven't seen that since before the financial crisis. So if you're close to retirement or if you're retired, fixed income, whether it's money funds, short-term bond funds, or even intermediate-term bond funds, clearly have a place. There was an article that we've come to joke about at the end of October on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It said the 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds is dead. It doesn't work anymore because at that point in time, at the end of October, the return year to date was about zero. The return now, a month later, is close to 10%, with both bonds delivering a nice return and stocks delivering a nice return. So there are lots of reasons to asset allocate across fixed income and equities, and for some investor, even into other things like private markets or real estate. We're big believers in diversification, and asset allocation is largely driven not by market opportunities, but one's personal financial plans, age, savings needs, and so on. And so we're generally advocates of people working with some professionals that give them a little bit of help, not trying to do too much on their own. But a general answer for you, Mike, is these days it's safe to say, with the era of zero rates being behind us, bonds have a place in most people's portfolios.
Great, thank you. Barry, I'm not sure I agree with you that Trump staying out of the primaries follows the same logic into the general election. I think he had only something to lose in the primaries and maybe feared people ganging up on him. I think he probably feels better about how he looks side by side with Biden on his feet. I don't know for sure, but that's my guess. But I do want to ask you, is there any scenario in which Biden drops out of the general election after the primary season is sort of done? And in that scenario, how would the Democrats choose a nominee?
Oh, you save the hard questions till late at night. I think the only thing that would cause Biden to purposely choose to opt out would be a health scare. It would have to be a stroke, heart attack, a fall, the kinds of things that befell people in their 80s. He seems, the public has concerns about his stamina and his ability to do the job. His physical health seems pretty good from a distance, but things do happen when one's in their 80s and living a challenging life. That would be it. It would have to be something serious, I think, for him to make that move. I don't know what would happen in terms of choosing a new nominee. I assume Kamala Harris would elevate and become the nominee. Lots of things come into play then, like each state has different laws about when the person on the ballot can be swapped out for someone else, or whether he could decide not to run. He could say that, but might still be stuck on the ballot in some states. And so voters would be choosing him knowing that actually Kamala Harris would be elected vice president and would take the presidency. There have been cases of candidates who are dead or not actively running who are still on the ballot. That's often the case during primaries when candidates bail out early on and the primary is still held and they're on the ballot. They win some votes, they get some delegates potentially. So a candidate could be not actively running and still winning votes. And my guess is that's the most likely way it would play out, but it would really depend when in the cycle that happens, if it's soon after the convention or getting closer to election day. Once we're within 90 days, I don't think there's much chance of changing any ballots.
And if he drops out before the convention, but after most of the primaries have been decided, how would they pick?
Yeah, the convention would choose the nominee, and they would have a lot of freedom because there won't be competitive primaries on the Democratic side this year. Biden's name is not even on the New Hampshire primary ballot. So you'd have a bunch of delegates arriving in Chicago next summer who would probably hash it out on the floor. And I think some of them would be inclined to go with Kamala Harris as the most obvious person. But there are also a lot of other views about other Democrats they'd like to see. You know, Bernie Sanders or someone else might get some interest there. Democrats also have super delegates, which the Republicans do not. They are elected officials who make up about 15% of the total delegates, and they are free agents. They're not committed to a candidate. And so that becomes a kind of unpredictable factor. Yeah, we haven't seen a real contested convention in many, many decades. So it would be something new. There'd be a ton of interest in that.
Great. Earlier tonight, Bill Rowerdink, one of our regular listeners from Detroit, mentioned Rasmussen polling that was done that suggested 20% of people who did mail-in voting said they cheated. I hadn't seen this poll, but is that plausible? And is mail-in voting really that much that prone to kind of fraudulent behavior? And how would I cheat on my mail-in vote? What would I do?
Great set of questions. I have not seen that poll. I will say there are real questions about Rasmussen and their reputation in the polling community. If you look for there's some analysis of their past performance and practices on 538. There's a real lack of transparency in their methodology, for example. So I'd want to dig into that a little more. I say mail voting's been pretty popular. I mean, a couple of things I could predict very confidently about 2024 is there's going to be a very even mix of some people voting in person on election day, some people voting early in person, some people voting absentee by mail. That's likely to be about a third in 2024. The United States has been voting by mail since the Civil War, when absentee ballots were first offered to people who were involved in the Civil War effort, soldiers who were out in the field, to mail their ballots home. And some states like Oregon and Washington have been doing essentially all of their elections by mail for several decades now. There's really just not evidence that it contributes to fraud in any significant way. It was heavily used, obviously, in 2020 during the pandemic, but it came back in 2022 in pretty heavy use as well. And there's just sort of no smoking gun to suggest any significant fraud. It'd be pretty difficult to execute. I mean, just a couple of things to keep in mind. To cast a ballot of any kind, a person has to be a registered voter. And so that process catches people who are not 18, who are not citizens, who do not reside in the district where they're attempting to register. You need documentation to prove you're a resident, and those other things. And then you've got to request a ballot, and there's a system to check to make sure that multiple ballots aren't requested by one person, that they're submitted by the intended voter, and all of that. So it's not a perfect system. It's really amazing that we pull off elections in this country, given how complicated and decentralized they are. But absentee voting is not a big worry in terms of security.
Great, thank you. Brad, welcome back. Every show needs a villain, and Brad appeared somewhat on a flipped screen like the Joker used to on Batman. So Brad, you're our villain tonight. Final question for you. Who are the big winners for artificial intelligence and its economic impact over the course of the next several years? We all think that's going to change some things in the economy. And who are the firms that you think might win the most? And what kind of workers win? What kind of workers lose from AI becoming a bigger part of our daily lives?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And I'm glad that you brought it up, because with everything we've covered here tonight, we didn't get to that. And it's obviously been a big topic this year. It's going to be an even bigger topic next year. Some of the winners, more or less, have been identified, which is some of the large companies that have invested substantial resources in AI, the Microsofts, and a number of the chip companies, and so forth. It's one of the reasons why NASDAQ's up 30%. It's one of the reasons why typically when you go through a correction, as we did in 2022, when a new bull market emerges, there's a leadership change. Well, the bull market in 21 in big cap tech was largely explained by superior growth and low discount rates applied to those big growth companies. Bull market in 23, different set of factors, rising rates, higher rates. In some sense, no improvement in top line growth yet, improvement in margins because they engaged in a lot of cost cutting, but then the great promise of AI and how it may be able to drive earnings in the future. So the market's very much betting that AI will continue to drive top line and bottom line growth in these large tech companies. That gets to other parts of the economy that can be beneficiaries. And at this point in time, it's safe to say the technology will become so pervasive and generally already is so easy to use, most companies will be beneficiaries in some way, shape, or form. At Neuberger Berman, we have over 2,000 people, and we've got over 1,000 active users of some type of AI technology, and it brings a lot of productivity. People are using it to write research reports. They are saving a lot of time and energy applying these tools, and we're in the early stages. In terms of individuals or workers that it will help versus hurt, again, the technology so far appears to be pretty easily adopted and pretty easy to use. So I'd say the vast majority of workers will be helped by this. It makes knowledge workers more productive. Who's going to be hurt? Well, large groups of people, let's say phone service representatives at phone companies or cable companies, be hurt by this. We're going to turn it all over to machines. Maybe. But again, at the end of the day, if you can put somebody in front of a machine and they don't necessarily have to have great language skills or great typing skills, but they can do work, I would say that the productivity and ability of people becomes enhanced. And I'm not yet in the camp that this is going to result in a 20-hour work week or large-scale unemployment. Based on what we've seen so far, I see far more benefits than detriments for the average American worker.
You're hanging in there, not joining the Luddites. Good for you, Brad. They've never been right, have they?
Never.
Yeah. Well, we're past the top of the hour. I want to respect your time, but I thank you both for a great evening, great conversation. We'll be back a year from now to see how we did again. And thank you very much for joining us. And we'll be back with our live stream again in January. I think our next show is slated for January the 16th. Topic to be determined. As always, thanks for listening. Really appreciate your participation and questions, and look forward to seeing you in the new year. Happy holidays, happy new year, best wishes for 2024, and on Wisconsin.
In 1848, just 2 months after the creation of our beloved state, a great university was born, the University of Wisconsin, to serve, educate, and benefit people from every corner of Wisconsin and beyond. And for 175 years, we have pushed forward, energizing dreams and igniting innovation. With educational opportunities that create promise and research that improves lives, UW-Madison is a place where an idea can change the world. And as we look forward, we also look back to stand up for what's right, build common bonds, and a better future. When combined with inspired goofiness and Badger spirit, there's an inspirational and unconventional vibe that's all Madison. It's more than just fun and games, though. At the UW, we go from brainstorms to breakthroughs, from today's students to tomorrow's leaders. This is where an idea can change the world, the whole world, a corner of the world, my world, our world. UW-Madison's profound eurekas and personal ahas transform us all and serve the greater good. As proud Badgers, we celebrate the last 175 years and the next as the UW charges forward. On Wisconsin.